In September 2020, Austria introduced provisions for descendants of Holocaust victims to acquire Austrian citizenship. We've discussed some of the provisions for acquiring Austrian citizenship in a previous video. In this video, we're going to talk about prevented return. This is when your ancestor didn't have a main domicile in Austria and was prevented from returning to the country for fear of persecution. To obtain Austrian citizenship under the prevented return principle, your ancestor must have been Austrian and between 30th of January 1933 and 9th of May 1945 have been abroad, not had a main domicile in Austria, and been prevented from returning to Austria to create a main domicile for fear of persecution at the hands of the Nazi regime. This principle also applies if your ancestor was born abroad and was prevented from returning to Austria. You can obtain Austrian citizenship under the prevented return principle, but only if your ancestor held Austrian citizenship as opposed to Austro-Hungarian nationality. This can sometimes be a tricky question, and it might often require reviewing historical documents to work out what citizenship your ancestor had. If your ancestor had a main domicile in Austria at some point between January 1933 and May 1945, you wouldn't be eligible for Austrian citizenship under the prevented return principle. This doesn't apply, however, if your ancestor lived abroad, didn't have a main domicile in Austria, but did return to the country temporarily for things like holidays or for short visits. For the prevented return principle to apply, your ancestor must have been Austrian. However, if your ancestor acquired a foreign citizenship at some times between January 1933 and May 1945, the prevented principle could still apply. All we'd need to show is that your ancestor had an intention to return to Austria, and at that time the ancestor was Austrian. Under recent case law, to benefit from this provision, your ancestor must have had an intention to return to Austria. There's a presumption that your ancestor intended to return to Austria if they belonged to a group that was persecuted by the Nazis. That includes Jews, Roma, Sinti, political opponents and disabled people, and Jehovah's Witnesses. In a recent case, the Viennese Provincial Administrative Court held that where an ancestor had gone abroad in the 1890s, had grown up in the USA, gone to school there, and had her whole family there, there was no established intention to return to Austria to create a main domicile. If you have an ancestor who was prevented from returning to Austria between January 1930 and May 1945, contact us. We specialise in helping people obtain Austrian citizenship under Section 58C, and we've helped hundreds of people obtain citizenship under these provisions.